Please be seated. Good afternoon. I'm Rabbi Peter Rubenstein, Rabbi Emeritus of Central Synagogue. And although it's not in our tradition that the family thank those who come to comfort them at the time of their mourning, on their behalf, I do thank you for being here. I know how many of you have been part of their lives in the past, and I know how they look to you for being next to them as they move forward into the future. As a matter of just policy, we would ask that you make sure your cell phones have been turned off. The family has asked me to announce that they will be sitting Shiva immediately following this service in the Lindenbaum Pavilion, which is immediately beneath this sanctuary, and they hope they would have the opportunity to greet you at that time. They will also be sitting Shiva on Monday and Tuesday from 2 to 4 p.m. and from 6 to 8 p.m. at their apartment, 550 Park Avenue, which is on the corner of 62nd Street. And both of those evenings, Monday and Tuesday, there will be a minyan at 7:30. They would also want me to tell you that should you desire, they would appreciate donations sent either to the Weizmann Institute of Science, at which a fund in Dan's name has been established, or to the UJA Federation of New York, to which Dan devoted himself so tirelessly. And I know on their behalf, I also want to take this opportunity to welcome those who are present but not physically, most specifically Rena Olshansky, Dan's sister, who is in Cleveland and unable to make this trip, along with many friends who are in London and we know are watching by way of live streaming. We know that we are celebrating a holiday, this festival of Pesach, the very temper of which is contoured by the asking of questions, to which there are generally very explicit and formatted answers given in the course of telling the story of our people's birth as they left Egypt. But today, sadly, so many of us arrive here with a single question to which we struggle terribly to find an answer, and we understand how ineffably difficult it is to comprehend the event which has brought us here together this afternoon. What we do know is that we are all bound by love and appreciation and admiration and gratitude for Dan. And we know that the greatest memorial will be the ways in which we build into our little corner of the earth Dan's extraordinary qualities, those qualities which for each of us he has helped shape and made a difference in our lives. We search for understanding, as did our ancestors of old, especially the psalmist who wrote Psalm 121. Esa einai el ha'arim me'ayin yavo ezri me'im Adonai oseh shemayim va'aretz. Al yiten lamot raglecha al yanum shomrecha. Hine lo yanum v'lo yishan shomer Yisrael. I lift up my eyes to the mountains, so from where does my help come? My help comes from God, maker of heaven and earth. For God will not let our feet give way. God will be our protector and does not sleep. The protector of Israel neither slumbers nor sleep. God is our guardian, our protector on our right hand. The sun will not smite us by day, nor the moon by night. God will guard us from all harm, will watch out over our souls, going and coming, now and forever. And a colleague in the last century wrote these words, which in so many ways have shaped our tradition and our understanding of life itself. He wrote, "Birth is a beginning and death a destination, and life is a journey from childhood to maturity and from youth to age, a journey from innocence to awareness and ignorance to knowing, from foolishness to discretion, and then perhaps we would hope to wisdom. Life is a journey from weakness to strength or strength to weakness, and often we would pray back again. A journey from offense to forgiveness and loneliness to love, from joy to compassion and grief to understanding, from fear to faith, and from defeat to defeat until, looking back or ahead, we see that victory lies not at some high place along the way, but in having made this journey stage by stage a sacred pilgrimage. So birth is a beginning and death a destination, and life is a journey, a sacred pilgrimage to life everlasting." And the psalmist asked, "Who shall dwell in your sanctuary? Mi yagur b'halecha, mi yishkan b'har kadshecha. And who shall dwell upon your holy mountain?" And this was his answer: "He that walks upright and does righteously and speaks the truth that is in his heart. It is he who has no slander upon his tongue, will not do evil to another, not harm his neighbor. It is he who honors those that fear God and will keep his oath even to his own harm and will not change it. These are the ones who will stand upon your holy mountain and will be with us forever." So how do we take the measure of any man? And how do we understand the place of that person in our life? Some would say that the measure of a person is simply length of days. And yet who among us could possibly believe that he who lives the longest lives the best? And there are some who would say that the measure of our lives would be the impressions we leave and the stones that we create as the foundation of the buildings we build, or on the front pieces of the novels we write. And yet, who among us can believe that the measure of any of our lives can be formatted in some way materially on some substance that we leave behind? The fact is, we all know that the measure of any of our lives is in the stories that people will tell, the memories that we leave, the way they are different because we touched them. And so today, we know that the wonder of human life is too complex and too magnificent to be memorialized. The gifts of spirit our loved ones give us cannot be measured or weighed. Even in our darkest hour, we know that at some time, their light and their warmth will be with us, bringing comfort and courage, and in the fullness of time, bringing some healing, and we would hope, peace. So we will hear this afternoon from some among many who knew Dan. In their own ways, each of these speakers represent a part of his life, a time in his life. And so in this order, we will hear from Stuart Blumberg, who will be reading words from Dan's sister, Rena Olshansky, whom we believe is watching. Following Stuart, we will hear from Bert Lehman, a friend and a colleague, and then Paul Roth, also a friend and a colleague, and then Dan's brother-in-law, Ellen's brother, Jim Spingarn, and then a good friend from London, David Blackburn, and then Dan's sons, John, Andrew, and Peter, followed by Dan's granddaughter, Eliza, and then, of course, Dan's beloved Ellen. Stuart?
Stuart Blumberg. Daniel Shapiro was my loving uncle, but actually I'm up here for my mother, Rena Blumberg Olshansky, Dan's beloved sister who's physically unable to attend today, but who wanted me to say a few words on her behalf. Dan and Rena grew up together in Cleveland, Ohio, the closest of siblings. Although she was 4 years older than Dan, they were always as equals to each other throughout life, each one supporting the other with a tremendous love and respect. My mother often remarked that she and Dan never fought. She remembers him as a child full of this sweetness and light, looking like this little angel with this immensely full head of curly blonde hair, to which a family friend once remarked, well, if he's like his father Ezra, he should enjoy it now. Dan was always a source of such warmth and love, even as a young boy. But my mom remembers something interesting. While most of us know Dan as an extremely talented communicator, as a child, he barely spoke until the age of 4. But he evinced another very precocious capability, namely an amazing facility with music. In fact, he could name any piece of classical music played, not just from the beginning, but from any section of any classical piece. And my mother remembers that people from the family in the neighborhood would literally come to the house and watch 4-year-old Dan perform this feat of musical savantism to everyone's amazement. So from a very young age, he was always exceptional in many ways. Now, Rena remembers Dan as a typical youth, full of friends, studies, and hijinks, but she says, looking back on his life, it is when he moved to New York that he truly became Dan Shapiro. And I think this is true. Dan was an amazing uncle to me. In fact, I really think I and many people who knew him took him for granted because he was just so consistently, beautifully graceful. When I heard of Dan's death the other day, my mind, for some reason, immediately flashed to the epitaph written for my grandfather Ezra Shapiro's memorial service back in 1977. Now, Ezra was a figure of huge importance to both Dan and my mother. And this epitaph was from Micah in the Old Testament, and it said, "What does the Lord require of you? To do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God." And immediately I thought how equally those words apply to Dan Shapiro, like his father before him, because Dan spent his life walking humbly with God, one of the most graceful and lovely souls I have ever known. I and my mother will miss you deeply, Dan, but we are so profoundly honored to have loved and been loved by you all the years you were with us. Thank you.
I'm deeply touched and honored to have been asked by the Shapiro family to talk to you about my dear friend, Dan. I loved Dan Shapiro. Now, I know many of you will say, I loved Dan Shapiro also. But let me tell you something. I really loved him. I met Dan 57 years ago at Columbia College. He recruited me to join a fraternity, ZBT. I have a very strong memory of this handsome, elegant guy with thinning, flaxen, blonde hair. He invented the comb-over, folks. I mean, and he really did have hair at one time. Although he was 2 years older, we bonded immediately. A bond that only strengthened over all these years. As Stuart just said, Dan loved to sing. And he had a magnificent voice. He loved to use that voice at fraternity parties. When a brother, we called them brothers in those days, got pinned, we called it pinned in those days, Dan loved to sing the fraternity love song. And he also joined the glee clubs and just had this most magnificent voice. Now, Dan came from a family deeply committed to Israel. His parents, Ezra and Sylvia, were very active Zionists in Cleveland, where Dan and his dear sister Rena grew up. Ezra and Sylvia made Aliyah to Israel in 1967, I think, or in the late 60s. And Ezra became the chairman of an organization called Keren Hayesod, which is the counterpart to UJA elsewhere in the world but the United States. And he served in that role until his death in 77. And among other things, Ezra was on the board of the Weizmann Institute. And as you may know, Dan followed him in his footsteps. Now, Ezra, by the way, was such a well-known figure in Jerusalem that there was a restaurant, I remember going to it, that served a dish called Steak Shapiro. And the Shapiro's deep commitment to Israel and to the Jewish people obviously rubbed off on Dan, as I'm sure many other speakers today will talk about. In fact, Dan first got me involved in Jewish affairs when he drew me into meetings of the American Jewish Committee. And I have great memories of Dan and I walking in Central Park between services here at Central Synagogue on a Yom Kippur day, walking and talking, killing time because there's a big break in the services, but those are memories that I'll never forget. Ellen Spingarn, who was at Connecticut College, as I recall, and Dan met was Dan's last year in college, I think, or in any event? Law school. Okay, law school. In any event, Brenda and I were delighted to be at their wedding. And as you probably know, that was the official start of an incredible, incredible marriage. Now, Dan and I and Brenda and Ellen continued our close friendship through Columbia Law School, where Dan was a James Kent Scholar, the highest ranking one could get in that class, and then at the Cleary Gottlieb Law Firm, to which he helped recruit me. And of course, and as Paul Roth will tell you, we continued to work together for almost 47 years as partners at the firm that's now called Schulte, Roth, and Zabel. But much more than law firms and college experiences bound Dan and me. Our families grew up together. The Shapiros lived at 1111 Park Avenue. The Lehmans lived at 1095 Park. Our boys were of similar ages. And in fact, Peter Shapiro and my son Douglas Lehman were virtually inseparable through high school. When Dan and Ellen were away, the Lehmans tried to look out for the Shapiro boys, and vice versa. And indeed, actually, our apartments in those days showed the damage that young boys can do when left alone. A recent beautiful exchange of notes between the Lehman boys and the Shapiro boys was just tremendously touching to me. Steve and Doug Lehman recalled that Dan took a genuine interest in the lives and thoughts of his children as well as their friends, and how compassionate and gentle and fun to be with he was. Peter and Andrew recalled wonderful childhood and adolescent memories of shared experiences they had with Dan and my boys. I was deeply touched and moved to tears, to be sure. And as families, the Shapiros and the Lehmans shared a number of tremendous events together, from Rosh Hashanah lunches, Yom Kippur breakfasts, Passover seders, Thanksgivings in Bedford, skiing vacations, bicycle trips. We spent a lot of time together. And not surprisingly, over these 57 years, Dan Shapiro never changed. From the sweet, kind, gentle, whip-smart, and thoughtful person that I first met in 1959. Dan had a great natural warmth, which I'm sure all of you in this room have experienced. He had a personality that attracted people and made them feel comfortable and at ease. I never met anyone who had a harsh thing to say about my friend Dan. And beneath that warmth and compassion was a very, very focused, extremely intelligent mind that could solve problems and assess situations quickly and expertly. Dan was a great, genuine friend to me. I could always count on him when I needed someone to confide in. And I played a similar role for him, I think. But despite the geographic separation of the last 15 years, we stayed in close contact by phone, at lunches and dinners when Ellen and Dan were in New York or Bren and I were in London. And in fact, Dan and I had lunch together just towards the end of March when he was in town. And he told me of some of his recent health challenges. Now, as we all know, Dan was blessed to have had Ellen as his partner in life. She's been a rock for him for all these years, a great and loving helpmate and companion. Ellen, we will admire you and love you for your selfless devotion to Dan and for your strength in these difficult times. And I just want to add a word about Dan's wonderful boys. John, Andrew, Peter. Dan was so devoted to you as you were growing up, and then as the very accomplished men that you have become. I know how proud he was of you and how each of you loved him dearly and confided in him greatly and relied upon him. Now, as we age, we learn that among life's most important components are relationships. The ability to connect deeply with others, to relate to them, and make lasting bonds is the hallmark of a life well led. My dear friend Dan Shapiro exemplified this magnificently. As I said at the outset, and I'll close now, I truly loved Dan Shapiro. And he was surely very lovable. Brenda and I will miss him terribly. We will forever miss the sweet, gentle, genuine, and magnificent human being that he was. And so I say goodbye to my friend. Farewell.
I want to thank Ellen and the boys for giving me the opportunity and the honor to speak about Dan's life as a partner of Schulte, Roth, and Zabel. In the spring of 1969, 7 of us would gather in the basement restaurant in Little Italy, a place called Grotto Azzurra, to plan starting our law firm. In addition to Dan and me, can you hear me? There was Stephen Schulte, Bill Zabel, Tom Baer, Jack McGoldrick, and Charles Goldstein. We really had more of a romantic dream than a business plan, but we wanted to give it a go. We planned to open at 345 Park Avenue, then the newest building on Park Avenue. We set our sights high. We soon learned that not everything went according to plan. And our office space was unfinished, so we temporarily made our offices at the former offices of the Junior League in the Waldorf Astoria. The first morning, August 4, 1969, we suffered some pangs of doubt. Was this really a good idea? The telephone did not ring all morning. Finally, around noon, some good-hearted soul called us from the Waldorf lobby, telling us our phones were not working. We let out such a sigh of collective relief. Things have improved since then. Schulte, Roth, and Zabel now has more than 350 lawyers and offices in New York, London, and Washington. Dan was an exceptional part of that growth. He was not only an extraordinary tax lawyer who published and lectured, but even more importantly, with his enthusiasm, upbeat personality, and optimism, he was a cheerleader for the firm both internally and to the outside world. He had that warmth that Bert Lehman just spoke about. He mentored so many of our lawyers, showing a patience and intelligence that were widely recognized and admired. He was such a positive influence in the firm and a model for all of us to emulate. Dan was intelligent, dedicated to client service, and always a gentleman. And he did all this while engaged in numerous and significant philanthropic and communal activities. As they say at this time of year, Dayenu. Dan looked to solve problems and build consensus. He had a talent for being able to explain why he disagreed with you without raising his voice or telling you that you were wrong. And his reasoning was usually so good, he carried the day. He and I worked closely to build our signature hedge fund practice. It was a labor of love. We loved working together. We loved the joy of building something. We both felt a little guilty to our families for the amount of time that we spent in the office. But we knew that you knew that we loved what we were doing. I admit that I was jealous of a great attribute Dan had. We would sit together to plan a meeting with a new client, and when we left the office, and as we got into a taxi, Dan would say, "Wake me when we get there." He was a master of what I called his taxi nap. And when he awoke, he was instantly alert and fresh as a daisy and good as could possibly be at representing the firm. As hedge funds began opening in London, Dan and I agreed we should capitalize on our expertise and probably open an office there. And in 2002, we did. Maybe even more significant than the fact that we opened an office in London is the fact that Dan was 63, an age when few men are looking to blaze new trails. But he and Ellen, at his side, enthusiastically embraced the challenge of bringing the firm to London, and what a marvelous job they did. They embraced London, and London embraced them. We are now have about 20 lawyers in London and are annually recognized as the leading hedge fund firm in London. Dan loved our firm. He loved that what we had started had grown into what it is today. He was a wonderful partner to me and a very, very special friend. Whenever he visited from London, we would try and spend time together, catching up on what we and our families were doing. Two proud fathers who knew and admired each other's children, swapping stories about them. One day during the last year, I felt compelled to tell Dan my feelings of respect, admiration, and affection for him. And in his understated way, Dan said, "Paul, it's called love." And I feel that for you as well. We had reached the place where, as two grown men, we were able to say we loved each other, and I'm so glad we got there. Until a week ago this past Friday, I never practiced law a day in my life without Dan. That is more than half a century. I will miss him dearly. And on behalf of my partners and colleagues at Schulte, Roth, and Zabel, I want to say we will always remember him. We will always hold him in the highest regard, and we will always thank him for what he did for us. Thank you very much.
look out, I see an absolute, not sea of faces, an ocean. It is unbelievable that one person and people streaming in can bring so many together on a Sunday afternoon like this. It must mean that that person was very unusual, very unique, and very beloved. And that certainly describes my brother-in-law, Dan Shapiro. I'm Jim Spingarn, Ellen's brother. Dan was a unique and very special person. We all know him for his great professional skills, sage advice, quiet humility, a fabulous sense of community and selfless devotion to myriad good causes. Also for his wisdom, caring, and kindness. You put all this together, you have a human being in a class by himself. He was always unassuming, but always a leader, and the speakers who preceded me gave you some details on that. Also, there was a playful and surprising side to Dan, too. And I got to see that as being a member of the family as we traveled together on a number of trips. And I remember an incident on a family holiday to the island of Jamaica 35 years ago, when getting a phone call from Ellen and my wife, Jane, we were told coming down for the Christmas holiday, for dinner, it was very difficult to get meat. It was scarce on the island. And they talked us into sneaking in, smuggling, a frozen leg of lamb in a golf bag. Dan was a little nervous about it, so was I. And by the time we hit customs, the bag was leaking. At that point, Dan whispered to me, "I'm afraid if we caught, I'm gonna get disbarred." It was the only time in 52 years I ever saw Dan nervous. In 1983, we took a trip with my parents for one of their anniversaries to Africa. It was sort of a labor of love for Dan because it was a family trip and the kids wanted to go and Ellen wanted to go, but he told me early on he really didn't think he was going to have much interest in this. So the first day went and he looked at this animal and that animal. He was happy enough. By the third day, Dan was asking, "Where's the rhinoceros? I haven't seen him yet," and some of the others. And he really got, as he always did, in the throw of things. Years later, again on vacation, it was typical Dan, completely in control. His bravery was tested by the Moroccan car he was driving when it lost its brakes coming down a mountain. I was in front of him and couldn't understand why he was gaining on me all the time. Fortunately, as in the States, there were some of those side runoffs, and he was saved. But he wasn't even slightly fazed. Dan treated his whole family, including mine, as we were all precious. No amount of interest, assistance, or time was ever too much, nor could you not call him at any hour. Ellen and Dan have been so wonderfully generous to our family. Jane and me, we've come into their flat any number of times to stay in London. It's wonderful. It's a treat. They're terrific. They lay out all the cards for the museums and leave their oyster passes for us. They couldn't be more wonderful to us. For many years, Dan and I must have spoken and emailed 2 or 3 times a week. He was the very best one could want of a brother, let alone a brother-in-law or friend. Dan, we're going to miss you an awful lot. Thank you.
I'm David Blackburn, and in the summer of 1959, after graduating from university, I made my first trip to the United States. After seeing the sights of New York and Washington, I visited my father's first cousins in Cleveland. And that was the catalyst for my friendship with Dan that started 4 years later in 1963 and lasted 53 years. Dan graduated from Columbia Law School and won a Fulbright Fellowship to the London School of Economics. Hard to imagine now, he knew no one in London, but his family in Cleveland knew mine, and as good Jewish families do, they put us in touch. I first met Dan when he was living at International House in London, and by 1964, we were both ambitious young lawyers with good academic credentials and young wives. Dan had by then married Ellen, who had joined him in London, and I was married to my first wife, Louise. We shared being newlyweds together, although Louise and I took a short lead in the family stakes. Ellen reminded me the other day how we demonstrated the art of baby bathing with our first child, Deborah, to her and Dan, who were still in a state of blissful ignorance in that area. Too quickly, the Fulbright year was over, and Dan and Ellen returned to New York. It was to be almost 40 years before I fully realized how much they had enjoyed that time and the mark that it had made on them. We stayed in very close touch and grew closer and closer. As our families took shape, Dan and I both became involved in legal practice, coincidentally as tax lawyers, introduced friends and clients to each other, and shared an ever-broadening spectrum of interests and experiences. When in 1969, as Bert and Paul have described, he and a small group of talented friends and colleagues founded what was then Baer and McGoldrick, I visited him in that first temporary office in the Waldorf Astoria that Paul referred to. And that year also saw the first Apollo moon landing. I was staying with Dan and Ellen in the country, and at my insistence, they woke up John to view it on TV. I haven't yet asked him whether he remembers, because if he didn't, I was going to say the effort was abortive. I remember how proudly and happily I introduced my new fiancée, Jan, to Dan and Ellen in New York, and how happy I was that they got on so well. The occasion had a bit of the flavor of introducing a serious girlfriend to one's parents. I think that Jan's principal initial emotion was relief that my friends about whom she'd heard so much were such a warm and interesting couple who were so welcoming to her. And in no time, we all had a new four-way friendship that went from strength to strength. I started to travel to the US quite frequently on business and enjoyed working with Dan and several of his partners enormously as a mixture of colleague, client, and friend for almost half a century. But much more importantly, Dan and I, Ellen and Jan, John, Andrew, and Peter, and the four Blackburn offspring grew closer. Again, coincidentally, two of each of our children went into creative showbiz-related careers, which gave us, a bit of a euphemism, additional layers of shared interests and experiences, and introduced us to the unique cocktail of pride, excitement, stress, and angst that comes with that territory. Dan rose to that much more effectively and much more wisely than I did. And I believe he was of much more help to his children in that area than for all my trying I have tried to be. As the years passed, we found and developed more and more in common. Friends, interests, values, singing, as Bert mentioned. Dan was actually much better than me. Homes in Bedford, we shared experiences and milestones of all kinds. and there was always that bit of extra spice that reflected the often different perspectives from opposite sides of the pond. We were truly delighted when in 2002, Dan opened and took charge of the Schulte, Roth and Zabel London office, and he and Ellen moved back to London. We looked forward to showing them the ropes, helping them make friends, and preventing them from becoming too homesick for New York. Any concerns that we may have had totally evaporated as individually and as a couple, they threw themselves with amazing enthusiasm and vigor into London, professional, business, social and cultural life, communal activities, new friendships of extraordinary diversity, theatre, movies, foreign travel, the length and breadth of Britain and beyond, and collecting photography. We will never forget the pleasure of sharing so much of all that, plus our family's joys and successes, as well as their trials and tribulations over 14 happy years in London. Dan and I were simply the very best of friends in the old-fashioned way. We had a huge amount in common and shared so much, so openly and frankly. Dan was a true soulmate and felt to me like the brother that I never had, except that I would have had quarrels with a brother, but never had a cross word with Dan. I will miss him terribly. My life and Jan's would have been far, far poorer without Dan. We will never forget his warmth, charm, humor, modesty, wisdom, and concern that were the bedrocks of our friendship and closeness. We will always treasure our memories of him and the times and experiences that we shared over so many years. Without him, life will truly never be the same again. It will be a very long time before we can come to terms with the fact that there will be no more breakfasts, lunches, suppers at home, dinners, wide-ranging discussions, festival get-togethers, milestone celebrations, movies, theaters, or gallery visits with him. Yiddish is not part of my Jewish heritage, so I don't know the official definition of a mensch. But for me, no one could have been more of one than Dan, and he was so, so much more than that.
Before I start, I just want to point out that the piano interludes that you've been hearing between the speakers are songs that were among the favorites of our father, and I want to thank Seth for performing them so beautifully. First, thank you all for coming and for the remarkable remembrances of our dad so many of you have shared with us. They mean so much to our family and have helped us realize that our pain and sorrow should and actually must be balanced with recognition of the tremendous good fortune we've had to be Dan Shapiro's sons. Dad was our role model. I think my brothers and I have been writing that to him on birthday and Father's Day cards for decades. Not only because he was successful and a recognized community leader, but because of what a great, generous father and all-around mensch that he was. Family was Dad's most important priority. And despite the huge amount of time he dedicated when we were growing up to work and philanthropy, he was always there for his boys. For biking in Central Park, playing touch football in our backyard in Bedford, or tennis at Century, he and my mom embraced life's adventures together in a terrific marriage, as the best of friends for 53 years. And he was also deeply dedicated to his sister Rena, to his 7 grandkids, whom he absolutely adored, and he showered them with love, and to nieces, nephews, and far-flung cousins from Cleveland to Israel. And considering how busy he was, it was good to know that Dad was a master of the catnap. He could grab Z's at any time, any place, no matter how loud or uncomfortable the environment. Dozens of family vacations and interesting and exotic destinations were a way to have special time together and deepen our bonds, especially after Mom and Dad moved to London. 2 years ago, I shot a 3-hour video interview with him in Mexico on one of our trips so that we and our kids' kids will forever be able to hear his life story in his own words, and I encourage you all to do the same thing with your loved ones. Our Deer Valley ski trip last month was especially meaningful, having all his kids and grandkids with him, all 14 of us, just 2 weeks before he passed. I recently had all of our family photos digitized, as well as Mom and Dad's childhood pictures, and we watched them together as a family in Utah, and that made him so happy and proud. Though we didn't know it at the time, it was a perfect curtain call. Although he had slowed down a bit in recent months, Dad lived life to its fullest until the very end. Last summer, I went to Israel with Mom and him for the 50th anniversary of the Israel Museum and also my 50th birthday. And in the last 2 years, he and Mom traveled to Machu Picchu in Peru, to game parks in South Africa, as well as to Poland and Italy, France, Thailand, Mauritius, and more. And we were already thinking of a new destination for our next family vacation. Mom and Dad are the definition of world travelers. They also shared a love of entertainment and art, particularly acquiring what's become a great photography collection. And the night before he left us, he was at the theater with Mom, laughing and loving the show they saw. What I'll miss most about our dad is his sweet smile and warm heart. And we're so glad that he went out on top doing all the things he loved with the people he cherished most.
People often ask how a lawyer like Dad produced 3 sons who were entrepreneurs in non-traditional fields. But Dad was an entrepreneur in law, co-founding Schulte, Roth & Zabel, and later expanding into London, in the financial world, helping to build the new investment firm Park Vale, and in philanthropy, merging UJ and Federation, and helping to create the JCRC. He took risks to achieve something and to do good. Dad was also a silent partner, a consigliere, and a wingman to each of us in everything that the 3 of us have done. He supported all of our dreams. And when we shared our wildest ideas, not only would he say, "Go for it," he would do whatever it took to help the dreams come true. Until literally the last week of his life, Dad was working with each of us on complex business matters and negotiations. And more than just in-house counsel to Shapiro Brothers, Inc., Dad was an uncredited co-producer in everything we did. He made a movie with U2. He opened music venues around the world. He helped reunite the Grateful Dead. He brought Curious George and digital 3D to movie and TV screens. He wrote books about the internet. And Dan Shapiro advised GE and other giants, through Andrew, on becoming sustainable innovators. All of this has got to make Dan Shapiro the coolest tax lawyer there ever was. And his involvement naturally led the 3 of us to collaborate amongst ourselves as well, which is one of the great gifts that he gave us. Throughout our lives, we will continue to ask ourselves, what would Dad do? But because he was our role model and our wingman throughout our entire lives, we will always know what that answer will be. Now, Dad has passed the torch to us, and we'll do our best to live up to his example at work, in the community, with friends, and the way he treated everyone that he encountered, and most importantly, with his commitment to his family. Dad was proud of us, and we are even prouder to be his sons.
So you guys can see that those of you who knew my dad well, he would cry at a movie. I mean, he was an emotional guy. And it's remarkable to be here, I mean, looking out at the place where we sat with our dad so many times. He loved this synagogue. And you'll hear from Peter about what a special relationship the two of them had. And my father's death, despite happening over a week ago, it still feels devastating. Dad, I can see you sitting there. You're my ballast, my guide, everything I've aspired to be. I love you, and I still can't believe that you're gone. I actually thought for a moment when I was writing this of emailing you a draft of the eulogy for your feedback, since that was what I did with everything important, books, articles, business plans. It's been a dark and surreal week, but also a time of unbelievable reflection and reckoning of all the things we've always known about you, and so many remarkable things we've all heard from so many of you here. Things like he was one of the most genuine people I knew, one of the kindest, sweetest, no one I admired more and looked up to. I mean, you've heard these things. And this has given us, even in this incredible sadness, a huge sense of gratitude and renewed inspiration to continue to try to live up to that example that my brothers spoke about. You know, in the spirit of Passover, I find myself asking, why is our Father different than so many others, or at least many of them? And as Stuart started talking on behalf of my sister Rena, to understand Dan Shapiro, and as Bert and others said, you have to understand his legacy. His role model was his father, Ezra, who arrived in the United States at the age of 3, coming from a small town in Eastern Europe called Volozhin, which was famous for its Talmudic learning, and in fact, his father's father and for many generations before that were rabbis. And he came to this country with nothing. He went to Cleveland. He rolled cigars in a factory in Cleveland for a while, my father's father, and then eventually worked his way through law school and became a renowned lawyer in Cleveland and a renowned Zionist, to the point where in the early to mid-1940s, when Ben-Gurion, the founder of Israel, came to the United States, there was a meeting not far from here on Fifth Avenue in a palatial apartment of a gentleman who invited 20 Jewish leaders from around the United States to meet with Ben-Gurion. My father's father was the representative from Cleveland, and at that time, he also held the position of law director of Cleveland, which meant he was kind of the chief prosecutor and law officer of the city. And yet, inspired by Ben-Gurion, he went back to Cleveland and started to raise cash from the Jewish community there in paper bags, because it was completely legal, and he would send money via Singer sewing machine boxes to the Haganah in Israel. And he and my grandmother, as you heard, ultimately made Aliyah in the late 60s after he retired, and he led Israel's global fundraising organization. And that example was just an indelible part of my father's DNA. And his mother's side also gave him huge naches, as he would say, or pride. His ancestors, the Lamports, endowed Yeshiva University. In the 1920s, they were some of the earliest benefactors of Jewish renewal in what was then Palestine, which would become Israel. And Dad continued that legacy. And what a legacy it was. My father, as you've heard, made people feel special. He was interested in you in a way, I think even earlier than Bill Clinton, that he could home in on you genuinely and warmly. As one of our childhood friends said, he was one of those rare adults who took an interest not just in his own kids and their friends, but in their thoughts and dreams as well. He had a true moral compass, a robust sense of right and wrong. He never showed anger, but he could get quietly and fiercely infuriated when he encountered wrongdoing. I mean, I can hear him now saying, "What? How can they do that?" As one prominent client of his wrote to me, Dad was a lawyer who embodied the qualities of Atticus Finch from To Kill a Mockingbird, which Eliza is actually reading in school right now. Integrity, fairness, and a passion for justice. He was an intellectual powerhouse. He worked incredibly hard. That's why he became, as one of the publications put it last week, a pioneer in the hedge fund industry. But we remember him working away. After we had dinner together, he would get back to work on his yellow notepads, and then later tapping away at all hours on that little BlackBerry that he never gave up. All the way literally to the end. We just learned that he had just ordered an iPhone last week. But with all his success, he was never boastful or sought credit. And it was that quality that allowed him to excel at work and in the philanthropic community. He was the one who was able to merge the two largest Jewish civic organizations in New York, UJA and Federation, because he didn't care who got the credit. He was chosen by Billy Tisch to run Federation because of his humility and his ability to build bridges. Dad was universally admired. As one of his childhood friends wrote to me, "Your father was the very best of us, the most brilliant, charming, elegant of men." Indeed, he personified that old adage of think Yiddish, dress British. His suits were even made on Savile Row, and he looked sharp. Just check out that poster outside. Now, you've heard my father was a remarkable speaker and writer, and he loved music and communicating through his singing, and you'll hear later more. You know, I will never forget every morning he sang in the shower, not just like the way some people like hum in the shower. He was belting out songs. You could have heard them outside. And as many of you know from parties, Mom and he frequently sang standards, often with words that they would write just for the occasion. Which reminds me of one of our favorite family legends. Back at Columbia College, you heard Dad was a singer. He was in the Glee Club with Art Garfunkel, and they became good friends. And one day, a young songwriter named Paul Simon came to the Glee Club looking for a singer to join him in creating a duo. Now, Simon initially asked Dad, even though he was balding and Garfunkel had that amazing Jufro, but Dad declined as he was headed to law school and knew that his classmate wanted to sing, so he gave Garfunkel the opportunity for that gig. Now, just imagine the list of recently departed music legends could have included not just David Bowie and Prince, but one half of Simon and Shapiro. Now, of course, that famous legend from our childhood was mostly apocryphal. Art Garfunkel was a friend, but he'd actually been playing with Paul Simon since they were in the 6th grade. Still, to us, it was a great fantasy for young boys who saw their father as a rock star, no matter what. The mourner's Kaddish that we say for the dead is a prayer praising God despite loss. And this feels right for our father, Dan Shapiro. I thank God for bringing my father into the world, for giving us the time we had with him, and for all the ways he did tikkun olam, healing the world. There's also a Jewish mystical concept that I recently learned from my Aunt Rena, my father's beloved sister, called the Lamed Vavnik, which is the 36 righteous people in the world whose role in life is to justify humankind in the eyes of God. A Lamed Vavnik doesn't perform miracles. He performs small acts of kindness that may seem insignificant, but together, these 36 hold up the world. And a person who is one of these Lamed Vavniks doesn't know it. In fact, someone who claims to be one is not. They are simply too humble to believe that they could be righteous. Now that sounds just like our dad. And while he is physically gone from us now, he feels more alive and present in me and for me than ever before. And for my brothers and for our wives and to all these grandkids, we hope and pray that you will feel this as well, now and forever. Love your siblings as Dad loves his sister, your spouse as Poppy loves Nana, your children as he loved us and all of you. Death will not diminish Dan Shapiro's impact. It is instead illuminating his qualities, like this beautiful sun outside that we are all experiencing in this April days, with starker contrast and finer granularity, so that we may internalize those qualities, build upon them, and continue the example of loving kindness my father brought to the world.
Hi, I'm Eliza Shapiro, the oldest of Poppy's 7 grandchildren. I was named after Poppy's father, Ezra, and I feel like I will always have a special connection to Poppy because of that. What made my grandfather so special was his selflessness and kind heart. He cared so much about everyone and always put others' needs before his. He was the kindest man in the world. He always thought of other people and strived to please everyone, and he certainly succeeded. I was so lucky to have him as a grandfather. I remember when I was a baby, Poppy would always make a popping noise like this with his mouth to make me laugh. That is how we started to call him Poppy. One of the many great memories I have of Poppy is when I slept over at their house when I was younger. In the morning, we always went to Burger Heaven for breakfast to have blueberry pancakes. The first time we went to order the pancakes, they said they didn't have blueberries to put on them, so Poppy went to the supermarket to get some. From that day on, we always brought blueberries with us to the restaurant until they finally added it to the menu. While we were eating, we would always play 20 questions and slaps, both games that Poppy taught me. I loved playing them with him. I will never forget all the fun times I had with him. We always went on fun trips with him, and my favorite thing to do was go visit him and Nana in London. They would take me to the swings and to ride on the double-decker bus, and we had so much fun. Even though Poppy is no longer with us, he will always have a special place in mine and all the other grandchildren's heart, and I will never forget him.
Oh my goodness, so many people here. You don't see how many people are here until you're standing here. Well, I wanted to speak to you. Maybe that's unusual, and I wanted to speak to Dan. So at first, I thought that, don't lean away. Did you? I don't know whether you heard me, but anyway, I thought I would kind of just have remarks and not write them down, but that's impossible. My thoughts were so fluid, and so it's better to have them written, and I'm going to read them, if you don't mind. First, let me thank the very eloquent speakers who captured Dan Shapiro, the man we so admired and loved. My gratitude to you, especially to my 3 boys, John, Andrew, and Peter, and to my beloved 14-year-old granddaughter, Eliza. I'm sure you'll agree that it's a challenge for a young teen to speak before hundreds of people when your heart feels broken. I know it does. I am blessed with the most amazing family that anyone could have. So many people have told me this, and it's absolutely true. You can see what a great family this is. I want to give a heartfelt thank you to all of you in New York and in London, my adopted home. From the minute you heard of our shocking loss, you flooded the boys and me with such attention. Those first 6 days in London, I was never alone. Thank you, David and Jan, especially. And here I have you. Your countless and extraordinary expressions of admiration for Dan and our many stories, your many stories of how he affected your lives constantly bring tears to my eyes, but nevertheless make me feel better. Listen to what one former Schulte associate wrote to Andrew. Your dad treated freshman lawyers so well. He didn't have to flex his intellect. If you drew an assignment with him, you considered yourself lucky because you would learn from the best and because he would treat you with respect. On a similar note, a secretary with 25 years at the firm told me she never heard Dan raise his voice, and she said that was highly unusual in a law firm. But it is essential at this moment that I speak directly to my 7 grandchildren, to Eliza, whom you have met, to 10-year-old William, her brother, an accomplished chef writing a cookbook, to Roxy, who is 10 today. How poignant that she claims another year on the day of her Poppy's funeral. To fun-loving Journey, who is 8 and already a young lady. To Simon, who is 6, Simon, and who made Poppy special snow desserts in Deer Valley. To Jasper, our do-anything dapper guy, who's also 6, and to Charlotte, who is 5 and could beat Poppy at Go Fish most of the time. An acquaintance wrote me that in first meeting Dan, when he came to see our photography collection in London, he decided that Dan's real passion was these grandkids. He said Dan's eyes lit up in describing them, and accordingly, he lit up the room. My darling grandchildren, Poppy's love was unconditional. He adored you, and I know you adore him. Please never forget the thumb wrestling he begged you to do, the squeezy hugs he gave, the hand-holding, and the lessons on how to make a poppy pop. Thank you, Eliza, for that. I still can't do it. Thank goodness our family of 14 had that holiday in Deer Valley just 3 weeks ago. Dan loved every minute, and I will cherish it forever. When Eliza was born, Dan told me he hoped he might see her walk down the aisle one day. Well, that wasn't really very likely, but dear Eliza, he will be there in your heart and in mine. In fact, I can promise you, each of you, Eliza, William, Roxy, Journey, Simon, Jasper, and Charlotte, that he will live in your hearts forever. He was the best, and he is the best in you. And now, dearest Dan, I want to give you the goodbye we never shared. We had a normal day that Thursday. You went to the office, as usual. You spoke with each of the boys. You related proudly to me later that you were able to positively restructure a contract for Peter, our music promoter, son. I made your favorite dinner, lamb chops, and we went to theater, where you laughed a lot, and surprisingly, you didn't fall asleep, as you sometimes do. We loved the show so much that you wanted to Google the actress to see what she'd been in. But instead, when we got home, you said you wanted to be in the sun next week. So I went on the internet and booked us 4 days in Mallorca. Dan, we are supposed to be in Mallorca now. Who would have guessed? And in 10 days, we are supposed to be with Jan and David in Rome. It's not hard to see why we loved London. After all, you could be anywhere in Europe for the weekend. We went to bed that Thursday night, and I never saw you alive again. The next day, there were thankfully friends who would not leave my side until I was able to bring you home. I didn't know there could be so much support, but they were really there in tribute to you. It all seems so unfair, but on the other hand, I know I got the lucky card. We met through a mutual friend of our mother's, and we had 53 years of a love affair and 52 years of marriage. It was a marriage full of respect. We simply did not argue. There was some criticism, mostly from me, regarding things like leaving the toilet seat up and cookie crumbs on the counter, and more recently, please sit up straight, which you wouldn't do. Jan knows. But never a bitter word from Dan. So now it is a sort of goodbye, Dan. But not really, because you will be in my heart every single day of my life, and I am with you. One last thing. I'm concluding with the fulfillment of my promise, the one you made me commit to when we listened in the car to the CD of the musical Ghost. If that wasn't enough, I found a handwritten note appended to our copy of your will, and it said, When I die, I want 2 or 3 songs from Ghost played at my funeral. Well, you have already heard Unchained Melody. Now this one, called With You, is from me to you, Dan.
Church this morning, I don't know why, I don't know why. Mr. Reynolds said to say hello. I started to cry, I started to cry. Every place we ever walked and everywhere we talked, I miss you. You never leave my mind. So much of you is left behind. Took my days with you. Took my nights with you. Those unfinished conversations we used to have still speak to me, and I write you letters every day that I'll never send and you'll never see. All this wishful thinking gets me nowhere. I can't stay. Though my heart is broken, it keeps breaking every day. You took my hopes with you. Took my dreams with you. Took my life with you. Took my world with you.
Oh, my love, my darling, I've hungered for your touch a long, lonely time.
As I reflect on this day, I realize what makes it so difficult is how contrary it is to everything that Dan was. Or if anything, Dan was rock solid and impeccably sensible and unconditional. And there is nothing about these events that would match that matter of solidity and sensibility and logic. And yet I realize that though we might not have chosen the timing, there is sometimes some sense in the coincidence of when things happen. That Dan died during the springtime this season, and that this service of memory is being celebrated during this holiday of Passover seems, as it should be, so right. For if there is anything about Dan, it is that when you think about his commanding legacy and how it is that he believed that everything is possible, it is a celebration of the miraculous. And in many ways, he was just that for so many of us. Two of Dan's extraordinary accomplishments come to mind, one communal, already mentioned, and one very personal. Dan, for me, embodied a moral tenacity and an impassioned optimism in believing that nothing was impossible. His magic, for me, was an incalculable ability to affirm each person, even the one with whom he disagreed. Dan knew that miracles unfold only when the forces for good can be nourished within all of us, and Dan committed himself to unleashing those forces in each one of us. He also relied on the rare presumption that when it comes to Jewish community, Jews really do want to do the right thing, but sometimes it takes the uniquely special right person to help us figure out what the right thing is. So it was, as you heard, that it was during his presidency of the Federation of Jewish Philanthropies from 1983 to 1986 that the long opposed and vociferously argued merger of the Federation with the local United Jewish Appeal became a reality, forming that extraordinary organization we know today as UJA Federation of New York. But not only did Dan view that merger as a major accomplishment following the model of his father, Ezra, who in the late 1930s already unified the Jewish Federation and the Jewish Community Council in Cleveland. But along the way, Dan indicated that the way he worked was by building consensus. In a Jewish Week news story published in June of 1986, Dan humbly reflected, "I think I'm viewed as non-confrontational." His primary principle was, "Let's keep talking," obviously a very Jewish native DNA trait. And so he did just that in pursuing the merger of UJA Federation by meeting with opponents, answering questions from the unconvinced, and impeccably keeping the vision of a merged UJA Federation and its benefits as a goal until finally the merger was voted. Our Jewish strength today could not have been accomplished without Dan Shapiro having been at the helm of our community when he was most needed. That accomplishment was, for those of us who lived through it, a communal miracle. And the personal one, simply stated, is that I would not be standing on this pulpit today if not for Dan Shapiro, fulfilling the promise to me that he would always be by my side. Dan was a member of the search committee of this synagogue when Central Synagogue invited me to interview for the position of senior rabbi in 1990. This congregation had gone through difficult times. While I was happily ensconced in San Mateo, California, which, by the way, is not a bad place to work or live. But during my first conversation with the search committee, on which Dan sat directly across the room from where I was sitting in a home up on Park Avenue, it became apparent that not only did the congregation and I have significant different views on particular ritual matters, such as wearing what they called a head covering and I called a kippah, but I was worried that the congregation wasn't convinced that it needed to forge forcefully forward in rethinking and transforming itself in ways that I believed would be essential, not only in the search for its own excellence, but for its very survival. And without my saying anything to him directly, and I came to understand this was part of his incredible ability, Dan intuitively read people. Somehow he understood my concerns, as he probably did for so many of you, without our saying anything to him. And so he reached out to me after that very first search committee interview. I already knew of his stature in the community, so I listened to him carefully and took what he said to me extremely seriously. And this is what he said, if not verbatim, pretty close to it, and very much in this spirit. He said simply, "Peter, you can do this. I promise I will be by your side when you need me. I will have your back. I will be with you when you're feeling troubled. I will stand with you when you're discouraged. Please come and help me help us. I promise I will be there for you." It was probably as much in the tone of his voice as it was his words, but I trusted him. He made us trust him, and he delivered on that trust. And when he said, "I have your back," he had our back. And it was that conversation as much as anything else that convinced me to come here. And quite honestly, when I looked out on the Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah, when sometimes he was one of the only ones in seat on time, and given that he was very recognizable even in a crowd, I reflected on how much he had meant to me. It was just one more small miracle of his in the making. And I assure you that Dan, as he did in my life and in your lives, always kept his promise, whether stated or intuitively understood. As you heard, John, Andrew, and Peter described their father as their role model, their friend, mentor, confidant, advisor, and one of the very few people that they know who actually cared what you answered when he asked, "How is it going? How are you doing?" Ellen talks about his dependability, how he would never hurt anyone, and how for over half a century they shared both thoughts and dreams. And if we need an indication of that love, the first song that we will play after the 23rd Psalm at the conclusion of this service, as we recess from this sanctuary will be Dan singing Unchained Melody to Ellen on the occasion of their 30th anniversary 22 years ago. It is a love song that endures beyond life itself, as he will endure beyond life itself. Dan lifted up his children and his family. He was the wind in their sails, and along the way, he had time to lift each of us up. He wanted that for us. He believed that hard work and commitment could create miracles, and he had the ability to make us believe that as well. So while the question why will perhaps go unanswered this afternoon, let us believe that Dan Shapiro made us better because he touched us in ways that only he could. And when we strive to be gentle and kind to people, especially those with whom we don't agree, I believe Dan will be in that moment. And when we begin to believe that the impossible can be possible, he will be there as well. And when we ask someone, "How are you?" and we actually listen and care about what they tell us, especially there, Dan will be with us. We have been given a gift. We cannot let it go. He will always be, now in memory, by our side. And for that, I personally, and I believe all of us, should be grateful. May he be a blessing. In memory, amen. Please rise. El malay rakamim shokin bamromim. Hamsei minukana chona takat kanfe hashkina. Im kadoshim utarim kazoha harakia mazridim. Nishmat Daniel Shlomo Ben Ezra Vitzvia. Shahalcha olamo. Baal harachamim yastarehu besete kenafav leolamim. Yitzro besro hachayim et nishmato. Adonai hu nachlato. V'yanuach b'shalom al mishkavo. V'nomar amen. Compassionate God, eternal Spirit of the universe, grant perfect rest into your sheltering presence to Dan, our beloved who has now entered eternity. O God of mercy, let him find refuge in the shadow of your wings, and may his soul be bound up so near to his parents, and may he have everlasting life. O God, be his inheritance. May he rest in peace. And let us say, Amen. Mizmor leDavid Adonai Eloi lo echzar. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures and leads me beside the still waters. He restores my soul and guides me in straight paths for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and staff, they comfort me. Prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You have anointed my head with oil, my cup runs over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in God's house forever.
Oh, my love, my darling, I've hungered for your touch a long, lonely time. Time goes by so slowly, and time can do so much. Are you still mine? I need your love. I need your love. No, I need your love for me. Lonely rivers flow to the sea, to the sea, to the open arms of the sea. Lonely rivers sigh, wait for me, wait for me. I'll be coming home, wait for me, my love, my darling. I've hungered for your touch a long, lonely time. Time goes by so slowly, and time can do so much. Are you still mine? I need your love. I need your love. God speed your love to me.
I